what's holding people back from excelling beyond average? Do you think it's talent, belief?
I think people don't do very much. I think people do a lot of talking about doing, not a lot of doing. And I think it's the doing that does everything. And I think and whether it's lack of motivation, lack of focus, lack of 100 different things, it just comes down to number of actions taken per unit of time. And I think the vast majority of people just wildly underestimate the volume that's required. And I think that's like, I hit on this so hard because like when, I'll tell you a story to illustrate the point. When I had my first gym, I had a mentor who told me that he got all of his leads off of flyers. And so that's what he did. And so I put out a flyer and I waited 2 weeks and one guy called me and said, "Hey, you dinged my Mercedes." And I was like, it's the only call I got. So I called the mentor up 2 weeks later and he was like, "Hey, how'd that go?" And I was like ready to give, I was like, "It didn't work," and he was like, and he like totally took it in stride. And he was like, "Well, what was your test size?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" He was like, "Well, what was your test amount?" I was like, "Well, I mean, I put out 300 in total." And he was like, "Oh man," he's like, "hard to know if anything's going to work with 300. He's like, "We test with 5,000 per batch." He's like, "And then once we find a winner," he's like, "we do 5,000 flyers a day." And I was like, "Oh." So he's doing 150,000 flyers a month for his business and I had done 300. And this is why like, I think the vast majority of people dramatically underestimate how much volume it is. Like, I mean, right when we started this, you're like, "Seems like you tweet all the time." It's like, I post that often on a lot of platforms. Now, Twitter is my home base for where everything is generated from. But like we make 450 pieces of content a week. And so people were like, "Hey man, I've been making content for 90 days. And that would already put them in the top, 1% because everyone gives up. But if you actually made a post every day for 90 days, I'd be like, "It's amazing. That's 90 posts." I do that in 2 days. And so, but they get there and they're like, "But I'm not Mr. Beast yet." It's just, and there's just, people think that someone else is doing 2 times or 3 times as much, but it's more often that they've done 1,000 times or like 10,000 times the amount of work that they have. Like if you counted the amount of videos that you've put out in terms of longs and shorts or minutes of content that you've put out over the last 4 or 5 years compared to somebody, it's not even, it's like, it's so ridiculous, the discrepancy. Same thing with sales guys. They're like, "Hey, I've been selling for 90 days. So I'm like, "Okay, so how many calls a day do you take?" And they're like, "I end up taking, 5 or 6 live calls." I'm like, "Okay, so you've been doing it for 90 days. You've taken like 400 live calls." It's like, "Okay, well, this is John. He's closed 4,000 deals. Not calls taken, deals. That's why he's better than you." It's just like, there's just a dramatic misunderstanding. And that probably with a 30% closure, he's taken 12,000 calls. It's like, he's done 300 times the work you have. Like it's a lot, or 30, but like it's a lot more than people expect.
So how do you compete with that guy? Because I bet there's a lot of those guys out there.
You start. I mean, I think it's like, you just start. And I think it's like, I think a huge amount of the delay that happens when people are starting out is the amount of time it takes for them to realize there is no easy way. So they spend a huge amount of time, they figure out how to do it. And then they spend a really long time trying to figure out if there's an easier way. And then they give up trying to find an easier way. And then they just start the hard way because the hard way is the only way.
How often do you get emotionally tied to outcomes?
I would say less and less over time. I'm sure that it depends on the outcome. It depends on the outcome.
What outcomes are you still emotionally tied to, even though you may know better?
Well, I think if the book launch for my next book that comes out, like if that goes well, I'll be stoked. If it doesn't go well, I'll be bummed. Like those are like, and I would say on a micro level, like we always hope that a YouTube video does well. We hope that, but obviously we have our constraints of like, okay, well, do I want this to be for a business owner audience or do I want this to be for more of a beginner audience? If it's a beginner audience, I have to kind of recalibrate my expectations because it'll get way more views. So, it's not like I'm a robot. I think I would say that my emotional regulation's just gotten better over time. It's not like it doesn't exist.
What other parts of your identity have you had to kill to become where you are right now?
Plenty.
I know one was attachment to the approval of your dad. That's something that's been spoken about quite often. Any other?
Yeah, I think so. It really depends on how we define identity. But if we define that by the actions that we take, like if you were to describe somebody like he is this way, you really describe it by the actions that person does, right? It's very hard to say someone is something without doing something about it, right? We even describe people by what they do. Like he's a carpenter, he is selfish, which means that he acts in selfish ways. Like it's all based on activity. And so, for me, like the changes in behavior, which then ladder up to identity, I've had to become more patient. I've had to figure out, which I define as figuring out what to do in the meantime. I've had to just have times where I'm like, I just need to let the turkey cook. I just gotta let it cook. There's nothing the right task for me to do is nothing. I've had to learn that.
Wasn't an easy change to like permanently adjust that?
Hard. No, and I don't think it's permanent. I think you have to fight it every day like addiction.
And so you think there are certain characteristic traits people just naturally have, or aspects of their identity that they will have for their entire life. They just have to be able to detect which ones keep them weak, and then it's an active battle for the rest of their life.
I guess instead of anthropomorphizing, so kind of like humanizing the things that we're fighting against in terms of behavior, it's more thinking like, I have been rewarded in the past for behaving in this way. And so it's hard for me to change that behavior, but I realize that that behavior no longer serves me. Now, you're still going to have the memory of the reward of doing that thing over and over again. And so what's really tough about human behavior is that punishment fades, but reward sticks. Meaning, like when you go out and drink, if you drink too much, the next morning you're hungover and you're like, I'm never going to drink again. But then a week later, you're like, you remember the reward, but you don't remember the punishment, right? And it's the same reason that people go back to ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends. It's like they remember the good times, but they forget about the bad times. So punishment fades, but reward sticks. And so the hardest behaviors to change are ones that have rewarded you in the past, because you will tend to remember the reward and want to repeat them. And so the only way to really beat those is to find something to do instead that rewards you better.
What's one of the things that worked for you in the beginning that stopped serving you as you've gotten bigger or more successful?
Well, one of the biggest ones that I talk about is when you quit the job and you start entrepreneurship, you get rewarded really big for taking a risk, for doing something different. But you don't need to take those kind of existential risks all the time. And the problem is that you get a massive reward for doing so in the beginning. And then you almost have to immediately unlearn that and then stick with this current path for an extended period of time. But you kind of always remember the hit of trying something new, which is why I think so many entrepreneurs tend to always want to do lots of new things, when most of the time they need to just get better at the thing that's in front of them and confront whatever problem they don't know how to solve so they can get that thing to the next level. And so they think that by doing something new, because that's what worked for them in the past, that's going to get them to the next level. When in reality, they just end up distracting themselves and trying to chase 2 or 3 masters at a time and never getting there.